April 16, 1945, 0300 hours. The ground shakes. 9,000 Soviet artillery pieces open fire simultaneously on German positions east of Berlin, the largest bombardment in history. For 30 minutes, the earth itself seems to scream. When the barrage lifts, 2.5 million Red Army soldiers surge westward toward Hitler's capital. Inside the city, 6 million terrified civilians huddle in basements while 45,000 Hitler youth, old men, and desperate Wehrmacht remnants prepare to defend ruins already reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. In 16 days, the Third Reich promised to last 1,000 years will die in fire, blood and madness. This is the end. The fall of Berlin didn't begin in April 1945. It began the moment Hitler refused to see reality. By January 1945, Germany's strategic situation was hopeless. The Red Army stood on the Oder River, barely 40 miles from Berlin. Anglo-American forces approached the Rhine in the west. German cities burned under round-the-clock bombing. Oil refineries were destroyed. Transportation networks collapsed. The Wehrmacht bled to death defending ground that couldn't be held. Any rational leader would have sought terms, attempted to save what remained of the nation. Adolf Hitler was not rational. In his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler studied maps showing armies that no longer existed. He moved phantom divisions across territories already occupied by enemies. When generals reported the truth that units were destroyed, that resistance was futile, he screamed about betrayal and cowardice. Reality had become his enemy. He retreated deeper into delusion, surrounding himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. The man who'd conquered most of Europe now commanded a shrinking island of fantasy in a sea of destruction. The Red Army approaching Berlin carried a fury born of unimaginable suffering. 27 million Soviet citizens died during the Great Patriotic War. Entire cities were obliterated, villages burned, civilians were murdered, starved, enslaved. The Nazi invasion had been explicitly genocidal. Lebensraum policy demanded Slavic populations be exterminated or reduced to slavery. Soviet soldiers advancing on Berlin had witnessed atrocities that defied description. They'd liberated death camps. They'd found burned villages with inhabitants murdered. They'd seen their comrades tortured, starved, worked to death. They came to Berlin seeking vengeance. Marshal Georgy Zhukov commanded the main assault from the east, the First Belarusian Front. To his north, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky led the Second Belarusian Front. From the south, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front would encircle the city. Together, these three fronts fielded 2.5 million men, 6,250 tanks, 41,600 artillery pieces, and 7,500 aircraft. It was the largest concentration of military power ever assembled for a single operation. Opposing them, Germany scraped together perhaps 1 million defenders, but calling them defenders overstated their capability. Army Group Vistula, commanded by Heinrich Himmler until his incompetence became undeniable, consisted of shattered divisions, Volkssturmliche of old men and boys, Waffen-SS fanatics, and foreign volunteers who had nowhere to retreat. They lacked ammunition, fuel, food, and hope. Many units existed only on paper. The Luftwaffe was absent, fuel shortages grounded most aircraft, and those that flew were vastly outnumbered. Berlin's 6 million civilians faced approaching catastrophe with dread and resignation. For years, propaganda had promised final victory. Wonder weapons would turn the tide. The alliance between capitalist America and communist Russia would collapse. Germany would prevail. But by April 1945, only the most deluded believed these lies. Berliners saw the truth in their bombed neighborhoods, their dwindling rations, their missing sons and husbands. They heard the artillery growing louder daily. The Red Army was coming, and everyone knew what that meant. Soviet propaganda encouraged revenge. Ilya Ehrenburg, the famous Soviet writer, exhorted soldiers, kill, kill. In the German race there is nothing but evil. Stalin himself promoted the narrative of righteous retribution. The message was clear. German civilians would pay for Wehrmacht crimes in Soviet territory. Berlin's women lived in particular terror, aware of mass rape committed by advancing Soviet forces in occupied areas. Fear permeated the city like smoke. April 16th, 0300 hours. The final battle began with apocalypse. 9,000 artillery pieces fired simultaneously along the Oder River. The bombardment, the largest in history, lit the night sky. German positions vanished in explosions. Earth and men were pulverized together. Survivors emerged from bunkers shell-shocked, deafened, bleeding from ears and noses. Then came the searchlights, 140 of them, illuminating German positions and blinding defenders, and through that terrible light came the Red Army. The Seelow Heights, the last major defensive barrier before Berlin, became a slaughterhouse. German defenders dug into fortified positions on elevated ground, poured fire into attacking Soviets. Zhukov's forces, attacking across flat, waterlogged terrain, took horrific casualties. Tanks bogged down in mud, infantry attacks stalled under machine gun fire. Soviet officers, under pressure from Stalin to reach Berlin quickly, threw wave after wave at German positions. The casualties were staggering, perhaps 30,000 Soviet dead in 3 days. But they had the numbers and resources Germany lacked. By April 19th, the Seelow Heights fell. Nothing now stood between the Red Army and Berlin. Soviet forces approached the city from 3 directions. Zhukov from the east, Konev from the south, Rokossovsky sweeping around the north. The plan was encirclement followed by systematic reduction. Berlin would be surrounded, cut off from relief or escape, then crushed. The timetable was political as well as military. Stalin wanted Berlin captured before the Western Allies arrived, establishing Soviet dominance in the post-war settlement. April 20th, 1945. Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday. It would be his last. In the Führerbunker, a concrete shelter buried beneath the Reich Chancellery garden, Nazi leadership gathered for a surreal birthday celebration. Göring, Goebbels, Himmler, Bormann, and military leaders offered congratulations to a man presiding over Germany's death. Hitler, increasingly frail and trembling from Parkinson's disease, made a rare appearance above ground to award Iron Crosses to Hitler Youth who destroyed Soviet tanks. Boys as young as 12 received medals from a dictator sending children to die for a lost cause. The gathering in the bunker was the last time senior Nazis would be together. They could hear Soviet artillery in the distance, a constant rumble that never stopped. The discussion focused on escape. Göring suggested Hitler flee to the Bavarian Alps, to the supposed national redoubt where resistance could continue. Hitler refused. He would remain in Berlin. The others could leave if they wished. By nightfall most had fled, Göring to Bavaria, Himmler to negotiate surrender with the West. Only Goebbels, the propaganda minister, chose to stay with the Führer to the end. Soviet forces entered Berlin's outskirts on April 21st. The battle became urban warfare at its most savage. Berlin was a city of 4.3 million buildings, spread across 344 square miles. Years of Allied bombing had already destroyed much of it, creating ruins perfect for defense. Every building became a fortress. Every intersection became a kill zone. The U-Bahn tunnels provided routes for movement and ambush. The city's layout, wide boulevards suitable for artillery, narrow streets favoring defenders, created a tactical nightmare. German defenders fought with desperate skill and fanaticism. Waffen-SS troops, knowing they faced execution if captured, fought to the death. Hitler Youth, indoctrinated since childhood, operated Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons with terrifying effectiveness. Teenage boys destroyed Soviet tanks at point-blank range before being killed themselves. Volkssturm old men, many veterans of World War I, defended neighborhoods with weapons older than their grandchildren. The Red Army fought methodically and brutally. Tactics developed in Stalingrad were applied in Berlin. Never advance without overwhelming firepower support. Artillery destroyed buildings suspected of harboring defenders. Tanks provided direct fire against fortified positions. Infantry advanced in small groups, clearing buildings room by room. Flamethrowers burned out stubborn defenders. The goal was not preservation but destruction. The city would be smashed flat if necessary. Civilian casualties mounted horrifically. Berliners huddled in cellars as fighting raged above. Buildings collapsed, burying families alive. Artillery killed indiscriminately. Those who ventured outside for food or water risked being caught in crossfire. The city's infrastructure collapsed. No electricity, no gas, no running water. Food stocks dwindled. The dead couldn't be buried, so bodies accumulated in streets and basements. Disease spread. Berlin became hell on earth. Sexual violence against German women occurred on a massive scale. Estimates suggest between 100,000 and 2 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers during the battle and occupation. Some were attacked repeatedly. Some were murdered afterward. Age provided no protection. Victims ranged from 8 to 80. Soviet military leadership largely ignored the crimes, viewing them as soldiers' right to revenge. The mass rape of Berlin remains one of the war's most horrific and under-discussed atrocities. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler's grip on reality disintegrated completely. The bunker, a cramped concrete complex of 18 rooms, became the Third Reich's final headquarters. Hitler spent hours studying maps, ordering attacks by armies that no longer existed. He insisted that General Wenck's 12th Army would relieve Berlin, that Steiner's phantom divisions would attack from the north, that victory remained possible. His staff, knowing the truth, humored him or faced explosive rage. April 22nd marked Hitler's final breakdown. When informed that Steiner's attack hadn't materialized because Steiner's forces were too weak and scattered to attack, Hitler erupted. He screamed that he'd been betrayed by everyone, that the German people had proven unworthy, that all was lost. For the first time, he admitted defeat was inevitable. He announced he would remain in Berlin and die there. His staff was shocked. The Führer, who'd never visited bombed cities or combat zones, would finally share his people's fate. But Hitler's decision to stay was less courage than spite. If Germany couldn't win, it deserved to be destroyed. On March 19th, Hitler had issued the Nero Decree, orders to destroy all German infrastructure before it could fall to the Allies. Factories, bridges, utilities, food supplies, everything was to be demolished. Albert Speer, armaments minister, had quietly sabotaged the order, knowing it would condemn Germans to starvation. Hitler's final weeks revealed the truth. He'd never loved Germany, only his vision of it. A Germany that lost wasn't worth preserving. April 23rd. Göring from Bavaria sent a telegram asking permission to assume leadership since Hitler was trapped in Berlin. Hitler, viewing this as treasonous ambition, ordered Göring arrested. The same day, Hitler learned that Himmler had attempted to negotiate surrender with the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries. This betrayal by der treue Heinrich, loyal Heinrich, shattered Hitler's remaining equilibrium. He ordered Himmler arrested and shot, though Himmler was beyond reach. The Soviet news tightened daily. By April 25th, Berlin was completely surrounded. Zhukov's and Konev's forces linked up west of the city. No relief would come. No escape was possible. Inside the pocket, perhaps 300,000 German defenders and 3 million civilians awaited their fate. Soviet forces began systematic reduction, fighting block by block toward the city center. The Reichstag became the battle's symbolic objective. This massive stone building, seat of German parliament until 1933, held no military value, but symbolically, planting the Soviet flag atop the Reichstag would signal Germany's defeat. Stalin ordered it captured by May 1st, May Day, the international workers' holiday, for maximum propaganda value. Defending the Reichstag were perhaps 5,000 German troops, SS, Wehrmacht, Hitler Youth and foreign volunteers. They fortified the building brilliantly, turning its labyrinthine interior into a maze of death traps. Barricades blocked corridors. Machine guns covered every approach. The basement held ammunition and supplies for extended siege. The defenders knew they couldn't win, but they could make the Soviets pay for every room. April 28th. Soviet forces reached the Reichstag and began the assault. The fighting was room-to-room savagery that lasted 3 days. Grenades, flamethrowers, bayonets. The building filled with smoke and screams. German defenders retreated upward, floor by floor, fighting from behind overturned furniture and office equipment. Soviet soldiers died in heaps on staircases. Progress was measured in rooms purchased in blood. In the bunker, Hitler prepared for the end. On April 29th, he married his longtime mistress Eva Braun in a brief ceremony conducted by a city official dragged from fighting. The wedding was grotesque, a bizarre pretense of normalcy, while Berlin burned above. After the ceremony, Hitler dictated his political testament, blaming everyone but himself for Germany's defeat: the Jews, the generals, the German people themselves. He expelled Göring and Himmler from the party for treason. He appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. April 30th, 1945. Adolf Hitler's final day. That morning brought news of Mussolini's death. Il Duce and his mistress had been executed by Italian partisans. Their bodies hung upside down in Milan for crowds to abuse. Hitler was determined to avoid such humiliation. He spent the morning saying farewells to his staff. He shook hands, distributed cyanide capsules to those staying in the bunker, and retreated to his private quarters with Eva. At approximately 15:30 hours, Hitler shot himself while simultaneously biting a cyanide capsule. Eva took only poison. Their bodies were carried into the Chancellery garden by staff, placed in a shallow crater, doused with gasoline and burned. The cremation was incomplete. Soviet bombardment forced the attendees back into the bunker before the bodies were fully consumed. The remains were later found by Soviet forces, identified through dental records, and secretly transported to Moscow. Joseph Goebbels, appointed Chancellor in Hitler's testament, survived his Führer by 1 day. On May 1st, after attempting futile negotiations with Soviets, Goebbels and his wife Magda murdered their 6 children ages 4 to 12 with cyanide. The children were put into nightclothes, told they were receiving medicine to help them sleep, and poisoned. Afterward, Joseph and Magda went into the garden and were shot by an SS orderly. Their bodies were burned, though less thoroughly than Hitler's. May 2nd, 1945. Soviet forces finally captured the Reichstag. Sergeants Yegorov and Kantaria raised the Soviet victory banner on the building's dome at 14:30 hours, photographed in an iconic image that symbolized Nazi Germany's defeat. The actual capture had occurred hours earlier, but the flag raising was staged for cameras and became one of history's most famous photographs. That same day, General Helmuth Weidling, Berlin's defense commandant, surrendered the city. Isolated pockets of resistance continued briefly. Fanatics who refused to accept defeat but organized resistance collapsed. The battle for Berlin was over. It had lasted 16 days. Soviet casualties exceeded 80,000 killed and 280,000 wounded. German military dead numbered perhaps 100,000. Civilian deaths were catastrophic. Estimates range from 125,000 to over 500,000, many from suicide. The wave of suicides in Berlin's final days was unprecedented. Families poisoned themselves rather than face Soviet occupation. Women killed their children then themselves to avoid rape. Nazi officials, fearing retribution, chose death. The exact number will never be known, but it was thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. Cyanide was so common that it became a grim joke. Göring's aspirin, May 8, 1945. Germany's unconditional surrender was signed in Berlin. The war in Europe was over. The city that hosted the ceremony was barely recognizable. 70% of Berlin's buildings were damaged or destroyed. The city center was lunar landscape. Rubble piles where neighborhoods had stood. The Brandenburg Gate, miraculously standing, overlooked devastation. The Reichstag was a burned shell. The Reich Chancellery was ruins. Dead bodies, both soldier and civilian, lay everywhere. The stench was overpowering. Soviet occupation was brutal and vengeful. Beyond the sexual violence, there was systematic looting. Anything of value, watches, bicycles, furniture, factory equipment, was confiscated and shipped east. The NKVD rounded up suspected Nazis, war criminals, and random victims for deportation to Soviet camps. Many disappeared forever. German POWs faced years of forced labor in the USSR. Many never returned. The Soviet occupation zone became a mirror of Stalinist oppression. The discovery of what Nazi Germany had done tempered sympathy for German suffering. As Allied forces advanced through Germany, they liberated concentration camps and discovered the Holocaust's full scope. Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. The names became synonymous with industrialized murder. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others deemed undesirable, had been systematically exterminated. The evidence was undeniable: gas chambers, crematoria, mass graves, emaciated survivors. The world recoiled in horror. Berlin itself held dark secrets. The Reich Security Main Office had coordinated the final solution from Prinz Albrechtstrasse. Records of genocide were stored in Berlin ministries. The bureaucracy of mass murder had been administered from offices now reduced to rubble. The city that had been the Third Reich's capital was also the Holocaust's administrative center. Berlin's destruction felt like justice. The human cost of Berlin's fall extended beyond immediate casualties. Families were destroyed. Children were orphaned. Women bore children conceived through rape. Communities were scattered. The social fabric that held civilization together had been shredded. Post-war Berlin was a city of widows, orphans, and traumatized survivors living in ruins. The political consequences reshaped the world. Germany was divided into occupation zones that would become two nations, democratic West Germany and communist East Germany, for the next 44 years. Berlin itself was divided, with the Soviet sector becoming East Berlin, isolated within East Germany but remaining under four-power occupation. The division symbolized the Cold War that followed the Hot War's end. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, brought surviving Nazi leaders to justice. Göring, Speer, and others faced charges of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The evidence presented, documents, photographs, testimony, provided authoritative record of Nazi atrocities. Göring committed suicide with smuggled cyanide before his scheduled execution. Others were hanged. The trials established precedents for international law that endure today. The question of German collective guilt haunted post-war discourse. Were ordinary Germans responsible for Nazi crimes? Millions had supported Hitler enthusiastically. Millions more had remained silent or complicit. The argument that they didn't know rang hollow when presented with evidence of widespread knowledge of persecution and genocide. Yet millions of Germans also suffered terribly, bombed, displaced, killed. Assigning moral responsibility for national catastrophe proved complex and divisive. Berlin's reconstruction took decades. The immediate post-war period focused on survival, clearing rubble, restoring utilities, preventing starvation. The Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, literally rebuilt the city by hand, forming chains to pass bricks and debris. Food was scarce. Many Berliners survived on Allied relief supplies. The Berlin airlift of 1948-49, when Western allies supplied West Berlin during Soviet blockade, demonstrated the city's new role as Cold War flashpoint. April 16, 1945, 0300 hours. The ground shakes. 9,000 Soviet artillery pieces open fire simultaneously on German positions east of Berlin. The largest bombardment in history. For 30 minutes the earth itself seems to scream. When the barrage lifts, 2.5 million Red Army soldiers surge westward toward Hitler's capital. Inside the city, 6 million terrified civilians huddle in basements while 45,000 Hitler youth, old men, and desperate Wehrmacht remnants prepare to defend ruins already reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. In 16 days, the Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, will die in fire, blood, and madness. This is the end. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, became the Cold War's most visible symbol. It divided the city physically, separating families and symbolizing ideological division. The wall stood for 28 years, a monument to Cold War antagonism. Its fall in 1989 marked communism's collapse and German reunification. Modern Berlin, reunified and rebuilt, preserves sections of the wall as historical reminder. The bunker where Hitler died was destroyed by East German authorities in 1987-88. The site is now a parking lot with small marker. This deliberate erasure reflected determination to prevent the site becoming neo-Nazi shrine. No grand monument marks where the Third Reich died, just an unremarkable parking lot in central Berlin. The banality seems appropriate. Veterans of Berlin's battle carried trauma for life. Soviet soldiers who'd fought from Stalingrad to Berlin returned home to Stalinist suspicion, Many were interrogated, some imprisoned, their contact with the West viewed as contamination. German survivors lived with guilt, shame and loss. The battle scarred everyone it touched. PTSD wasn't diagnosed then, but symptoms were universal: nightmares, hypervigilance, inability to discuss experiences, alcoholism, suicide. The historical lessons of Berlin's fall remain debated. Some view it as inevitable consequence of Nazi aggression: you reap what you sow. Others emphasize the tragedy of millions caught in catastrophe they didn't create. The truth encompasses both. Germany unleashed war that killed tens of millions. Germans also suffered terribly when that war returned home. Civilians always pay the highest price for leaders' crimes. The brutality of Berlin's fall reflected the war's nature. This wasn't a conflict between gentlemanly armies respecting laws of war. It was existential struggle between totalitarian systems, each viewing the other as evil deserving annihilation. The Eastern Front's 4-year nightmare of massacres, atrocities and genocidal policies created a cycle of violence that climaxed in Berlin's ruins. Mercy had been burnt out by Stalingrad, Leningrad, Auschwitz and countless other horrors. For Soviet soldiers, Berlin represented vindication. They'd survived Hitler's attempt to exterminate them, defended their homeland, pushed the invaders back, and captured the enemy capital. The victory cost unimaginable sacrifice, 27 million Soviet dead, but it was complete. The red flag over the Reichstag symbolized their triumph. That the victory led to Soviet domination of Eastern Europe and decades of Cold War oppression was a tragedy those soldiers couldn't foresee. For Germans, Berlin's fall meant catastrophe, but also, paradoxically, liberation. Liberation from Nazi tyranny that most had supported or accepted. Liberation from a war they couldn't win. Liberation from a regime that would have destroyed Germany rather than admit defeat. The end, though brutal, allowed rebuilding, both physical and moral. West Germany's post-war democracy and economic miracle were built on ruins of Berlin's fall. The final irony: Hitler promised Germans a 1,000-year Reich. It lasted 12 years and ended in Berlin's rubble. The man who swore he'd never surrender shot himself in a concrete hole while his capital burned. The regime that claimed racial superiority died unmourned and despised. The empire built on violence collapsed into violence. The Third Reich's epitaph was written in the ashes of Berlin. April 16th to May 2nd, 1945. 16 days. The bloodiest urban battle in history. The Soviet Union's final revenge for 27 million dead. Nazi Germany's apocalyptic end. Adolf Hitler's suicide in a bunker while his dream burned. Berlin fell not in glory but in madness, horror and degradation. The city that hosted the 1936 Olympics, that Speer redesigned as Germania, world capital of Hitler's empire, was reduced to smoking ruins contested by desperate men and terrified civilians. The regime that promised order brought chaos. The leader who demanded loyalty from millions died abandoned by almost everyone. The ideology that claimed superiority ended in demonstrable failure. The fall of Berlin was justice, tragedy, vengeance and catastrophe inseparably mixed. It was earned and undeserved, deserved and unjust. Simultaneously, millions of individual stories of soldiers, civilians, perpetrators and victims merged into collective experience of a city dying and a world changing. Standing in modern Berlin, in the peaceful city rebuilt on those ruins, it's difficult to imagine the horror that consumed this place in April 1945. The scars are hidden now, paved over and built upon, but they're there, beneath the surface, in the memories of survivors and the historical record. Berlin fell, the Third Reich died, the world moved on, but we remember, we must remember. April 16th, 1945, 0300 hours. The ground shakes. 9,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously on German positions east of Berlin, the largest bombardment in history. For 30 minutes, the earth itself seems to scream. When the barrage lifts, 2.5 million Red Army soldiers surge westward toward Hitler's capital. Inside the city, 6 million terrified civilians huddle in basements while 45,000 Hitler Youth, old men, and desperate Wehrmacht remnants prepare to defend ruins already reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. In 16 days, the Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, will die in fire, blood and madness. This is the end.